One. Hello, this is Kent Comfort with Tallgrass Economics. Want to welcome you to the first of a series of podcasts that Dave Kingsley and I are going to share with you. And those podcasts, the topic is fighting the medical industrial complex for the people. And I think you're going to find this series to be really interesting because we not only will be sharing information, and Dr. Kingsley will be sharing information that he has accumulated over a fairly large span of time. We're going to have guests come on with us too to tell us stories about specific experiences they've had and specific work that they've done in this area of fighting the medical industrial complex. Remember that term because it's an important term. Hey, Dave, good to see you. How have you been up there in Kansas City?
I'm doing pretty good, Kent. We've got a little cool weather here today. Good to see you. How's it down in Albuquerque?
Well, it's, they call it the land of enchantment for a good reason, Dave. It really is. It's just delightful here. Delightful.
Yeah. That's great, Kent. And, this podcast is part of our Tallgrass Economics network that we've developed with various professionals and entities around the country who are in the field of healthcare and look at our podcast. And I might remind folks that what we're about at Tallgrass Economics is the politics, political science, economics, finance of the elderly in the United States and how the government interacts with the elderly. Mostly that's what we look at. So we'll be talking a lot on these podcasts about the medical industrial complex, which, let's face it, that includes Social Security and, Medicare and Medicaid, which are under the Social Security Act. How much of that money is being siphoned off into corporations that we consider the part of the medical industrial complex. And we'll define what that means, what that term is. Many people have heard it, but I want to kind of tie it in with our Tallgrass Economics network around the United States, professionals, people that we interact with in our work on researching and advocating in the field of healthcare. So that's kind of a little bit of background. I think people will get a better feel as we go along. And as you say, we want to invite some folks with a lot of information to share with us onto this podcast.
Absolutely, Dave. That's a very helpful intro to where we want to go with this. And I know that you have some thoughts about kind of laying the foundation or the framework for how we're going to record and distribute this information that is so vital that the public needs to know about so that they're not so flummoxed about how something that's supposed to be so good for the American population has kind of turned out just the opposite.
I think the ideas behind Social Security, all the benefits that fall under the Social Security Act, which include the medical benefits, Medicare and Medicaid. And let's face it, Medicaid is for all age groups. It's not just for the elderly. And we'll talk about how that is. I think we probably would have a pretty good start today by explaining to our viewers exactly what is a medical industrial complex. What is that? Many people hear it. It's like the military industrial complex that President Eisenhower spoke about in his farewell address. I sat down and thought of the most common.
Well, let me interrupt real quickly. How about you kind of lay out what an industrial complex infers to start with? That might help set the stage.
Well, when we talk about an industrial complex, whether it's finance, it's military, it's medical, it's government funded programming, tax monies, money that you have to pay indirectly, and it's corporations who offer themselves to provide those services. It involves the government providing the funds. So basically, the complexes that we talk about, and there's a lot of complexes uh, that we talk about, is a sort of a network of pathways for money to flow from the government to private industry. Let's say, I like that idea of pathways for capital flow.
Yeah.
So we privatize a lot of our healthcare in the United States. And what I mean by privatize, we contract, or we work out some sort of an arrangement with a for-profit company, some private entity. Sometimes, though, it does include nonprofit hospitals, nonprofit nursing homes. So you have these entities that are incorporated that are providing a service at a fee, or for a reimbursement.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at, let's take an example. I think examples work pretty well. Let's take Medicare. You're paying for the Medicare you receive about 2.5% out of every paycheck. Actually, it's 2.8, 1.4% employer, 1.4% for you. That goes into the Medicare Trust Fund. That's a pool of money. And the providers, as we call them, let's say St. Luke's Hospital or Little Sisters of Charity Hospital, will provide a service and bill Medicare for that service they provided you. Now, they have an agreement on how much that's going to be. It's what we call the contract allowance. So that's basically the most simple aspect. But
Okay.
then you also have pharmaceutical companies that are selling various types of pharmaceuticals. You have the medical device manufacturing companies that are providing hip replacements, heart stents, all kinds of medical devices. And we have insurance companies. We don't want to overlook that. We have United Health, we have Aetna. That's another part of the complex, because they're providing coverage, health insurance, based on what they have, based on the arrangement they have with the government. So anyway, that's what we call the medical industrial complex. And that's what we really want to get into, because that is where we see all of the costs that we're talking about, all what we consider excess costs. And let's talk about that a little, Ken. How much are we paying in the United States for providing funding to this medical industrial complex? How much are we paying compared to, say, Sweden, England, Japan? Why are we paying double? And I'm answering my own question. Why are we paying double? So these are the kinds of issues we want to talk about. We pay per capita, we expend per capita in the United States double what is expended in Japan, or maybe triple Japan. It's double, let's say France. It's triple what we spend in England, and everybody's covered in those countries.
Right.
So this is basically, we want to know, well, if we're spending so much more than other countries, if you're paying so much out of your pocket for pharmaceuticals or for your premiums, why is that? And we need to answer that question.
You bet. And we know that, for example, these other countries that you're talking about, they're essentially delivering these vital services, when you say on a cost plus basis. In other words, they know what their costs are. They have to cover those costs and then some, to have some reserves in order to accommodate some unprogrammed and unexpected circumstances. Whereas here in America, if we are privatized, the idea is to charge, and this is basic capital premise, charge as much as you possibly can and deliver as little as you have to maximize the profit gain from the enterprise. That's good business. I
think we should focus on that. That particular point is, how do you as a business enterprise price what you're charging? Normally you price based on what it costs you to manufacture that product or to provide that service, plus about 5 to 10%, somewhere in there, for profit, for net above your operating costs.
Right.
You want your revenue to exceed your operating costs by at least 5%. But let's say we allow 7.5% or 10%. For various reasons, and we can get into why the net might be different, but that would be pretty normal. And you say, well, okay, I'm going to price this heart stent at what it would cost me to manufacture the next heart stent plus 7.5%. That's what we call marginal cost pricing.
Mhm.
But that's not happening in privatized U.S. medical care.
No, there's no room in there for the shareholder.
Well, yeah, and so if you can manufacture, let's say, an insulin drug, and we've talked about this before, you can manufacture an insulin drug for $6 to $10 a vial. And then what we see, and this is a factual situation right now, we see diabetic people who have to go buy that insulin and are being charged $400 or $500 a vial, or maybe 300, 400. There's different types of insulin. Some's more expensive than others. But the point is, how do you explain such an excessive margin between what your manufacturing costs are and what we're charging patients? And we see that throughout.
Oh, okay. I have a question on that. Let's use the insulin as a model. Can we deconstruct what the industry's explanation for that outrageous difference is, how they justify it? Can we take that down? What is their rationale? And then what do we know to be the reality of why that rationale just doesn't hold water?
Well, there's been typically what they say, and this is based on many writers that I've read and my own observations. Kent, as you know, I spent my last part of my career teaching in a medical school,
right,
and health policy and management. So I've had a chance to look at a lot of these issues, and what the experts on the pharmaceutical, or critics basically, they're experts and critics of the pharmaceutical industry. They're going to say, well, the pharmaceutical industry says, well, we have to charge this much because it costs us so much in R&D, research and development. In other words, to do the clinical trials and so forth, to bring that drug to market, if indeed it is shown to be effective, safe and effective. Well, the truth of the matter is the universities do a lot of that research through NIH grants. In other words, so the pharmaceutical companies then just team up with the university to get a patent where they can share. And we can dig into pharmaceuticals more as we go down the road. But the whole patent research and patenting in pharmaceuticals changed in the early 1980s with what we call the Bayh-Dole Act, which Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana and Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, when they passed a law that allowed for federally funded grants for pharmaceuticals. Once those pharmaceuticals were developed, then the university could then team up with a private for-profit enterprise to sell those drugs. So that's what started to drive university medical schools in doing this research. So there's no real strong evidence that we need to charge, and we'll get into more details on this with various drugs. There's no real detailed evidence out there that we need to be charging that much based on the amount of investment we've made in R&D, because a lot of that investment came from the federal government in the first place. And now they're turning around and spending our Medicare and Medicaid dollars to buy those drugs.
Right. And if I may, I'll contribute two other elements to this factor. The first is many of these are public companies, and you can see what their R&D as a percentage of revenues actually is, and it's alarmingly low based on their claims. And
That's
the
right.
second factor is when they are selling this product in other markets offshore, they know they cannot get that kind of money for it, and they're perfectly willing to supply those other markets at greatly reduced prices.
You know, at my department at KU Med, we had a relationship with Sweden. And I had an occasion to have dinner with a group of us had dinner with the physician who's the head of the whole Swedish healthcare system. And one thing I remember most about that dinner meeting was when he said how the United States in our medical or in our government funded healthcare system paid whatever the pharmaceutical companies demanded. He kind of laughed. He said, we would never buy drugs that we weren't negotiating over price. And as you know, Ken, when they passed the Part D of Medicare, which was the drug benefit in 2003, in that bill, they included provision that HHS could not negotiate. We're not allowed to negotiate drug prices. Now, let's stop a minute and think about the medical industrial complex here, because we're going to be talking about other facets, not just pharmaceuticals.
Right.
But let's just stop and look. Okay, how does that complex? How does those interrelationships? You've got the pharmaceutical companies over here who pulled their money to lobby Congress, and that they have and we'll be putting out these exact amounts, but about 3,000 people working in Washington on lobbying. They've probably in the last decade spent $1 billion lobbying Congress. So that's part of how the medical industrial complex works. Yes. And then you have the legislators, they're part of the medical industrial complex, taking the money to run their campaigns. So you have the company, you have the politicians, you have the universities who are seeing that as a route to riches, that their mission now is to grow their drug business, not to turn out doctors. Well, they do turn out doctors and do a good job of that. I'm not saying they don't, except they see themselves now more like the corporation. More like that. See what I'm saying?
This is kind of an aside, Dave, but it's fascinating to me how commonly you just described essentially a three-legged stool. And that seems to be a very common model for a lot of this. It takes three different entities working in concert to formulate a medical industrial complex kind of model to kind of wrap their arms around the whole situation and control it from soup to nuts. Did I say that right?
Yeah, and there's another thing we call government capture. So you have agencies, and we see this particularly in the nursing home business, and we'll get into that in great detail. The agencies in the states and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, we call CMS, the federal regulating agency over nursing homes or over the development of drugs, the FDA, let's say, these agencies have been captured by the industry. In other words, they are doing what the industry wants them to do because the industry can bring pressure to bear on the regulators, the employees of the federal government or the state governments. So,
and it should be the other way around, shouldn't it, when you really think about it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the FDA, let's take that as an example. And we'll talk about the Alzheimer's drug that was just approved that most everybody knew was not an effective drug. Right. And we'll talk about that specifically. We got so many things to talk about.
Yes, we do.
But because there's a revolving door between the FDA and industry, a revolving door between, say, the Senate Finance Committee and industry. So you have that kind of government capture through you can get a much better job over on what we call K Street in Washington.
Yeah.
That pays you far more than working for the Senate Finance Committee. So that's a plum job if you're a Senate staffer, is to get on that Senate Finance Committee. They funnel a lot of staffers over to K Street. So if you're a Senate staffer, what are you going to do if you're thinking about your future? You're going to do whatever the industry would like for you to do. Maybe not consciously, Ken, maybe consciously, but that's the name of the game in the United States.
Yes, it's a pathway. It's a pathway that if you get on it, you've got to follow the path. Yeah.
So let's look at the bigger picture. I mean, let's summarize all the money we're talking about in U.S. healthcare.
Good.
We have what we call gross domestic product. That's everything we produce, sell, all the money that flows from production in the United States, goods and services. And in the United States, about $24 trillion. 20% of that, I want to say that again, 20% of that $24 trillion, 1/5, is medical, related to the medical industrial complex. Now, just real quickly, if you look at France, Japan, England, Sweden, all of the other peer countries of the United States, it's half of that.
Yeah.
So what that's telling me is the products and services that are being provided aren't worth what we're paying for.
Well, let's add another element to that comes to mind. We talked about, as we started, this is for the people. Well, the other countries, one thing that's inarguable is when it comes to training and technology and devices and so forth, the United States is the world leader.
That's right.
We are doing it better than anyone, to the extent that why should others even try to compete? Why don't they just buy what we produce and deploy it on their model in their country for the people? And that's what they're doing.
In fact, they do, Kent. They pay half the price to U.S. pharmaceutical companies that the U.S. pays.
Yes,
exactly. So again, we're going back to government capture here, okay? Right. And there's a term we'll be talking about as we go through these sessions. One is an economics term called rent seeking.
Yes.
And people need to remember that word, rent seeking. What that means is that a pharmaceutical company produces a drug and sells it not for the marginal cost pricing that would be appropriate, but whatever they can pressure Congress into, whatever they can pressure the government through their brute strength of money and power.
Mm-hmm.
So the price we're paying is going to be far greater than what the actual product is going to do for us and what that actual product is worth. We call that rent seeking. It's money above and beyond what you would pay for a product or service based on what that's supposed to do. And we'll be looking at that in nursing home companies. We'll be looking at that in medical device manufacturing. But you know, when we look at this whole bigger picture, it's full of graft, it's corrupt, and we can't leave out the politics. You know, if you're an economist and you're describing the U.S. economic system, and you're not talking about the political arm, you're not talking about all of the money that the industries are pouring into campaigns and political PACs and so forth, then you're really not describing their medical industrial complex. And that therefore makes whatever you're talking about not what we're talking about, and whatever you're talking about is invalid. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't exist.
Exactly. So you said graft and corruption and politics. So, and then you defined them almost as synonyms.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's gotten that way because we've seen over the last 40 years a form of debauchery and decadence in our political industrial system.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have all these companies now because of the laws that have been set up, or the way the laws have been interpreted, what Supreme Court case of Citizens United, it's almost like it's a law of the jungle. It's where, give you an example of, there was a conservative industrialist in Chicago. He built a company called Trip Light, which is these, one thing they made were these strips that you plug your computer into, and so forth. He built that into a billion-plus corporation. He then donated. He's a very political person, so he donates that company to a political PAC, a very far-right conservative political PAC.
Yeah.
And that political PAC sold that company to Eaton Corporation for $1.6 billion. So now you have this massive amount of money, and it's called the Marble Fund. Those far-right conservative think tanks or PACs, it's not a think tank, it's a political action committee. One of the things they're going to be down on is regulation. That's one of the things they really want to kill is regulation, no matter what kind of regulation it is. And we need a lot more regulation. So that is, again, the tentacles of the medical industrial complex are spread out. And so now we're spending double in the United States, funneling money. And that money, when we say we're spending money, that's coming from taxpayers. Even if your employer gives you health insurance,
yes,
that employer is taking a write down on that. That's one of the biggest write downs on taxes in America.
of course. Yes. Well, so we've been going here for a little over 30 minutes. So I think we're getting close to capping things for our first session. But I want to suggest kind of in closing that there's one term that neither one of us have invoked today in this conversation, which I think is interesting. And that term is health care. Because that's really not what we're talking about, is it?
No,
We'll
bring that up when we talk about the war on cancer.
Yeah, oh, very good. Yeah, and so we have in the realm of, or in regard to for the people, we have a system that puts so much financial burden on the taxpayer, on the average person, that the number one cause for household bankruptcies in America is medical bills.
And the question becomes, why should you go bankrupt because you need medical care?
Exactly. So
which takes me, Kent, as we go down the road, I think one of the most important things we want to ask are of the people who view our podcast, of the people we interview and bring onto this podcast, why? Why did the American people put up with the system we have, which is so unfair and so much more corrupt and bloated? Bloated isn't even a good word because it's bloated on steroids. I mean, this system is so bloated and there's so much graft, and let's call it what it is. So that's one thing we want to do is ask why. Why are people putting up with it?
Yes, and what comes to mind there as you speak, Dave, is the fact that we started right after World War II. We got on this track of the employer being the source of access to medical care for most Americans at that time. That is no longer the case, of course. That's part of the problem, is that model kind of fell apart. But other countries didn't do that. Other countries didn't do that at all. And so we're, in our efforts to kind of take apart the links in the chain that got from there to here, that'll be an important factor.
And Kent, one of the things we're going to talk about is, why do employers provide health insurance in the first place?
In the first place, right.
They benefit far more than the employees, even though it appears on the surface to be a great employee benefit, and it is. But the employer is keeping wages suppressed because they're going to say, hey, we're going to sweeten up your package, your health care package, and then they get reimbursed, or they get to write down their taxes and keep wages low because they're sweeten up the package for health.
Exactly. And to that point, there is a hidden cost it's not so hidden, but it nevertheless is. If I'm working for a company that provides a benefit that I need, and I know I cannot move somewhere else and get that benefit, and I hate my job, imagine how that impacts my performance on the job. And I'm staying there for no other reason than to, maybe my wife has a severe illness that is being accommodated through my employer benefits.
Right, and we're going to look at all this stuff, Ken. And just in closing, we want to bring on a physician that can explain to us how he sees the pharmacy benefit
Great.
intermediary, pharmacy benefit manager. Maybe this is the first time many of our viewers have heard of it. They need to know about that. These are unnecessary intermediaries, corporations that are getting part of the money that we really don't need.
Right.
We have the managed care thing. We'll be talking about that. All of these sort of enlightening our viewers who aren't aware of these things. And viewers who are aware of these things, we hope we can begin a conversation with them.
Yes, very good. Well, so in closing, I want to encourage our viewers to just inundate us with questions and comments about the information that we have put out here so far today, because we've covered quite a few different elements, quite a bit of ground, even this quickly. And I hope that raises a lot of questions, and I hope it stimulates a lot of inquiries. And we want to hear our viewers' suggestions about particular issues and situations that they want to make sure we do not overlook in our series.
And the last thing I'll say, Kent, is we won't pull our punches. We will talk about the lying, deceit, manipulation that's going on in the United States. It's causing the American public to get worse health care than they're paying for.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Dave, great to see you again. Really looking forward to the next session. And I think we're providing something here that people really, really need to connect with. And I'm pleased to be a part of it.
Enjoy those great blue skies out there in Albuquerque.
I am. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
See you next time.
You bet.